Welcome to Proudly Asian, a podcast series that tells bold and proud stories of Asians by Asians. I'm Isabel Wong, a financial journalist who wants to uncover the many Asian stories around us that are waiting to be told. There's never just one way to look at Asians. This podcast will take you through a deep dive into the life stories, struggles, and triumphs of young Asians around the world. On today's episode, we have Dr. Anthony Ocampo, a Filipino-American sociology professor at Cal Poly Pomona. Born and raised in LA, he's also the author of the books The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino-Americans Break the Rules of Race, and Brown and Gay in LA, The Lives of Immigrant Sons. He talks to us about growing up brown and gay in LA and how Asian identities could be defined. Welcome back to Proudly Asian Season 2. While we were away, we were definitely keeping ourselves busy trying to line up new episodes for the season. But so happy to be back with you all again. And since the launch of this brand new season falls in June, which is also usually when Pride Month occurs, we are kicking off the season with our guest, Dr. Anthony Ocampo. For Netflix fans, you might have seen Anthony on one of the Netflix documentaries, White Hot, The Rise and Fall of Abercrombie and Fitch, where he talks about his experience of being discriminated against because of who he is. But now, let's welcome our guest. Welcome to Proudly Asian, Anthony.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. But before we get into the actual conversation, I'm just really curious. How did the Netflix filming go for you?
First of all, the place where they had the actual recording was really interesting. It was like some hunting clubs, and so on the wall there were literally dead animals that were hanging on the wall. I guess they were trying to do that whole Abercrombie and Fitch look of the cabins and the wilderness or whatever. But yeah, we filmed in 2020, so it was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and so it was really weird because I had been quarantined at home. I hadn't really seen a lot of people, and then all of a sudden we were in a studio filming, not a studio, a set filming the documentary. And I guess the other weird part is that this documentary was filmed in 2020. This experience that I had with Abercrombie and Fitch, where you alluded to, I used to work there when I was 18 years old in the year 1999. And then they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't rehire you because we already have too many Filipinos working here." That occurred in the year 2000, so it's literally 20 years ago. And so it was really funny to talk about this period of my life that I thought is just very much in the past. And then when the documentary came out in 2022, all of a sudden you had all these people from my different chapters of my life reaching out in social media and DMs saying, "Oh, good job on being on the documentary," but also sharing their own really messed up experiences with the store. So I was pretty shocked to learn that the Abercrombie thing is very triggering for a very, very large number of people.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned about the set, because I was actually going to ask you about, because I remember they had really interesting sets, and now I was going to ask if they were real, but then you just answered my question. But I would like to get into knowing a little bit more about yourself by asking a question that I ask every single guest of mine on the show, which is tell us a bit about your background. Who are you? What are you? And where did you grow up?
How do I answer this question? Who are you? That's such a big existential question these days. But yeah, I'm a son of immigrants. My parents are immigrants from the Philippines. My mom, shockingly, is a nurse. My dad worked in real estate. I'm an only child, and I grew up in Northeast Los Angeles, in a little neighborhood called Eagle Rock. Some folks that are Filipino might recognize it because it's a neighborhood with a lot of Filipino residents, both immigrants and children of immigrants. So I grew up in LA, but in terms of my day-to-day life, I'm a college professor. I teach sociology at a university in Southern California, and I also consider myself to be a writer. I write books, I write articles, usually about topics related to immigration and race, Filipino identity, LGBTQ issues. What else can I say? I have a dog, so I'm a dog parent, but beyond that, that's Pretty much it. I also identify as queer, so that's an important identifier for Pride Month, of course.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, just a quick follow up. Do you speak Tagalog? How many languages do you speak?
Oh my gosh. Do I speak Tagalog? You know what? If I am in the Philippines and I've been there for a couple weeks and I've had a few drinks, then I think, yes, I would say absolutely I can speak Tagalog. But normally here in the United States, I grew up speaking English. I grew up in a household where both Tagalog and English was spoken, but like a lot of Filipino-Americans, my Tagalog skills are lacking, but I can understand Tagalog pretty well. So if you throw me in the middle of the Philippines, at least where they speak Tagalog, I can pretty much get by pretty all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're definitely not alone. That's what I heard from some of my Filipino-American friends as well. But specifically for yourself, what was it like growing up in LA in a Filipino-American household? And what is an experience that most Filipino Americans would find relatable?
Yeah, I mean, there's like about 4 million Filipino Americans at the most recent count. And I was lucky in that I grew up in a household that had a very strong sense of Filipino identity. So what I mean by that is like, I had my grandmother here. Sometimes both grandmas were living here. We had aunts and uncles, cousins that lived in our household. And so even though I was an only child, it felt like I was never really alone because there was always some extra relatives that were living in the house. And what was nice is that, through those people, I had a lot of exposure to all things Filipino, from Filipino food to the language to Filipino like pop culture, like TV shows, game shows, things like that. And it was a really tight knit family. So we saw each other several times a month, and there was always large family gatherings. So I think that is something that a lot of Filipinos relate to, is this multi-generational household experience where it's not just mom and dad in the house, but you have all these other people living there. And I think that the other part of it too was when I was younger, I used to go to the Philippines at least every other year for visits. And so I spent a lot of time there as a kid. Just going to the Philippines is a very different experience than like growing up Filipino in the United States, because you're just surrounded by a whole different world. I mean, as much as you can grow up with Filipino family in the States, it's just totally different when you're immersed in Manila and just seeing everyone around you is Filipino as well.
And I mean, just a quick question: what's your favorite Filipino dish?
Oh my gosh, I'm a palabok fan.
Oh,
and then if it's like a cloudy day, I'm a big sinigang fan as well. What else? Obviously like desserts are great. Halo halo is the perfect summer thing to just feel refreshed. But actually, let me give you a more obscure dish. When I was a kid, I think my favorite dish was paksiw, lechon paksiw.
Oh.
I had an aunt that used to make it, and I just thought like, this is the most interesting thing I've ever tasted. But yeah, I would say as a kid, that's my favorite. I would take the paksiw and then take the sabaw and then pour it on the rice. So it was all like, we do that with the rice is all moist with whatever soup you have.
Yeah.
But honestly, these days, I think my biggest comfort food is I will forever love Filipino breakfast, like the tapsilogs, logsilogs. Whenever you go out on a Saturday night and you have too much to drink, it's the perfect hangover food.
Yeah, that definitely sounds nice. And now, I mean, I would like to switch the topic a little bit and talk about your experience growing up as a queer person in LA. How was the experience for you?
Yeah, it's funny because I think as a kid, you don't really. I mean, I was born in 1981, and so growing up in the 1980s, you had a very limited exposure to what gay or queer people were. I think the only exposure I had to it as a kid was seeing the topic of HIV or AIDS come up. And so being gay was equated to like a death sentence, which is obviously not the best example of gay communities to grow up with. And in addition to that, the only gay people that I ever saw on TV were usually white gay people. And so for a long time, I think that I just didn't have the vocabulary to really articulate what I was feeling inside. Like I knew that I felt different from other boys that I was growing up in my family or in my school. And I think in retrospect, like when there's a certain age where a lot of boys start to have like crushes on girls, or they talk about who they like in their school. And I always, looking back when I think about this period, I always felt like I never really had that inclination to have a real crush on a girl. Of course, like you said, you like someone just because you had to say something. But yeah, I mean, being gay didn't even really enter my thought process until I was much older, because, you know, you grow up with very negative images of it. Like, for everything from the church says being gay is a sin to it's wrong or it's unnatural. And then I think I saw like a few images of gay people from the Philippines, and almost always it was these like hyper flamboyant like caricatures. Like, first of all, let me just say that I absolutely love anyone that can be flamboyant, man or woman, non-binary, whatever. But at the time, like, it was always made fun of. It was always portrayed that like these gay figures on Philippine television were more like either comic relief or outcasts. And so it was really hard to really put together the idea that I myself might be gay until I got way older and I met other gay men of color, gay Black men, gay Latino men, other gay Filipino and Asian Americans. And it was until I met those folks that I thought, oh, maybe I am actually part of this community as well. I just didn't really put two and two together.
And I mean, as you mentioned, you met other, LGBTQ plus community members from different cultural backgrounds, right? Like, would you say your experience growing up as a queer Filipino man was quite different from, other Asians who grew up as queer and gay?
I think that I think honestly there might be more similarities than differences. As a kid, like, I grew up around a lot of Filipinos, but what's funny about where I lived in LA is that I didn't really have a lot of other Asians that lived in my neighborhood or went to my school. So for the most part, because I went to Catholic school, and so most of the Asians that were there were Filipino descent, and so that was what I knew. That's what I was exposed to. But I get the sense, like, from what I know of all my friends who are Asian American, like other East Asians and Southeast Asian groups, that, when you're a son of immigrants or a child of immigrants, you feel like there's this huge amount of pressure to like fulfill your family's immigrant dreams, and there's this like pressure you feel to live out the hopes and dreams and ambitions that your parents have after they migrated to this country. I don't really know if like my mom and dad ever sat me down and said, hey, we're immigrants and like we have big dreams for you. But for whatever reason, I think a lot of children of immigrants absorb that message somehow. And I actually have a book coming out in September of 2022 that it's about the experience of growing up gay in an immigrant family. What I learned is that a lot of folks have that experience of feeling that same sense of pressure that their family wants them to be one thing, but they, in their hearts and minds, are actually something very different.
And I mean, next up, I would like to talk about your coming out experience.
Yeah.
How was it for you? Was it terrifying?
Oh my God. Yeah. It was really oh my gosh. Yeah, it was very terrifying. Yeah, it was scary. I mean, I think part of it was shaped by the fact that I'm an only child. And so, and other people have told me this. They've said like, oh, I'm gay, but I have siblings. So like my siblings can, my parents have my siblings to focus on or whatever, to not disappoint them. But I think it was really scary because for most of my life, always tried to be like the perfect son, the perfect kid. I got good grades. I went to college. I went to graduate school, landed this job as a professor. And I felt like in a lot of ways, like I was doing what my parents had asked me to. The only part that I couldn't really do is the part where they were like, oh, we hope you marry a nice girl and have kids. And that was the part that always felt a little bit like I couldn't fulfill that. obligation. I was about 22 years old, 23 years old when I think I came out to my mom. I don't think she'll ever listen to this, so let me just tell you the whole truth. But yeah, we were at a I think some family event in New Jersey, and it's a really funny story. I guess she had like saw a bottle of pills in my bag. So at the time in my early 20s, I was a smoker. I smoked cigarettes, and I was trying to quit smoking cigarettes. And one thing you do if you go to the doctor and you tell them you want to quit smoking, they give you Wellbutrin, which is an antidepressant. So it actually serves the purpose of helping people quit smoking. Well, my mom's a nurse, as I mentioned, and so she saw this bottle of Wellbutrin in my backpack, and she said, why do you have this? And are you depressed? Because she saw it from the nursing point of view, but like these are for depression. And I said, no, I'm not depressed, but I used to smoke, and so I have them because I don't want to quit smoking. And my mom was like, you smoke? And so it was just very like, oh crap, whatever. I was just like telling her disappointing things left and right. And then after the conversation was about to end, she said, if there's anything you want to talk to me about, please, you can always talk to your mom. And in my mind, I thought, oh my gosh, she's giving me the opening to tell her that I'm gay. So I told her, like, Mom, not really into girls. I don't think that's for me. And let's just say that that's not what she anticipated I would have said. So I kind of came out to her by accident. And then I think when it came out to my dad years later, I had a relationship with the man that I was really in love with, and I had broken up with him. And I just felt I hit this point where I felt like these really important things were happening in my life. Like I had a full on relationship. I was in love with someone, and I felt like I broke up with someone, and I felt like those are things that you should be able to share with your family. And, I had a lot of my cousins that knew that I was gay, but not my parents. And so after I felt like there was this distance between me and my dad that couldn't be overcome because I was keeping up the secret, I just ended up telling him. And I don't think either of my parents were like, they didn't kick me out of the house or anything, and they were never like violent. Like I know a lot of people experience really violent reactions from their parents sometimes, which is really sad. But I know that they were not. I think they were disappointed because I think that a lot of their dreams that they had for me involved me getting married and having kids. And I think they're kids people too. So I think they really wanted grandkids, at least in the traditional way. And it's just like, I'm the only kid. So I think that that's also another factor that played into it is like, they had other nephews and nieces who were openly gay and they're fine with them. But I think it's just really different when it was their kid. So to be honest, it took a couple of years for them to come around. But nowadays, like, they're super cool. Like when my mom and dad need something, they'll call my partner Joe. They won't even call me because they think that he's more helpful than I am. But that was, oh my gosh, that was like 20 years ago or something when I came out to them. And now,
wow.
Yeah, I think it's 20 years I came out to them. And I think the first maybe like 5 or 6 years, it was a little bit funky, maybe even 8 years. I don't know. But like after that, it's, they've been super supportive. And I love that my parents love my partner as much as they love me. So
wow, what an experience. And I mean, of course, looking back, if you could ever speak to your younger self when you used to kind of like wonder about your differences, or like wonder how you should approach, coming out to your parents, like would you do anything differently? What would you tell your younger self?
Oh, that's such a lovely question. I think that when you're going through that stuff, you really... Like, I haven't really thought about this in a very long time, but I think that there was a point in my life when things were, me and my parents weren't on the same page when it came to me being gay, where I used to like pray. I used to just ask God. I'm like, God, please just like get us to whatever tomorrow looks like, whatever what's over the hump. Like, just get me there as fast as possible because I really can't see it right now. And that was a I was for a long time, I wasn't really sure if we would ever get to the point where we would be wholly accepting of each other, but yeah, I think I would tell my younger self, I would say, all those things that you used to get made fun of for, or you used to get reprimanded for, all, dancing and singing and acting effeminate and just enjoying figure skating and gymnastics, all the things that you love to do that boys aren't supposed to do, quote unquote. You should just say, screw it, embrace those things and find joy in those things, because there's actually a lot of other young boys out there in the world that love those things too. You're just gonna have to have faith that you're gonna find them one day.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a nice advice. And I mean, I'm going to get more of your advice as well, but this time it's not for younger self, but for like family and friends of, people who are part of the LGBTQ community. Like, what will be your advice for those who are, anxious about the sexual orientation of, let's say, their sons, their children? How could family and friends be supportive?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's really hard to give advice on this because every family is different. But what I would say is that, well, the least you can do is to not stigmatize people for acting like expressing their gender in a way that doesn't, quote unquote, fit with your perception of what gender should look like. So, for example, like if you have young boys that want to play with dolls or want to, put on a dress, like there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If you have little girls that want to play with trucks and, do quote unquote boy things, there's nothing wrong with that either. And I think a lot of times what I see, even in this day and age, like in the year 2022, I see a lot of parents that like scream at their young boys who want to play dress up or want to play with dolls or want to pretend to be girls. And same thing with, their little girls that want to do quote unquote boyish things. So don't do that. I think that you should just let kids be kids and whatever they enjoy. Let them express themselves, because it's really beautiful to see them play with different different ideas about who they are. That's awesome. I think the other thing too for relatives, one thing I would say is that if you have young kids, don't always like pressure them with the story of like, oh, to a young man, oh, when you marry a nice girl, or when you have a girlfriend, or vice versa to a young girl, oh, when you find a boyfriend one day, because a lot of times those are statements that stress kids out if they already know that they're queer. And so I think little gestures like saying, oh, whoever you fall in love with, whatever they may be, whether it's a boy or girl or someone that has no gender, like that's a really subtle thing that parents and other relatives can say, but it's really, really powerful it's a really powerful way to signal to kids that you're not expecting them to be straight. I think another thing too that family can do is that if you ever hear comments that are homophobic or transphobic, if you have a kid that's queer and they're watching what you're going to do and how you're going to react, and if you let those comments happen and you don't speak up, it's going to send a message to those kids that you're not accepting of gay people. And I think that the other thing too is, one thing I wish that I could have for my own relatives and family is I have a lot of family that are really accepting of me being gay or accepting of my partner. But one thing that they don't really do is they don't really do that much. They don't put in that much effort to learn about LGBTQ history or LGBTQ issues or LGBTQ pop culture. And so a lot of times, even if you have family that it's, they're heterosexual and they accept you, it's still not fun to hang out in those spaces if you have to pretend to care about all the things that straight people care about. I have a lot of wonderful things that are happening in the queer community that I would love to talk about with my straight family members, but I feel like there's not an appreciation of those things. And so I think like I would love if family members just really, really indulged in getting to know not only who their queer kid is, but also the queer community that their kid belongs to.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, a lot of the times, the most hurtful words actually came from family members, and it would take kids years to unlearn all the toxic thoughts and, to get over those comments. So yeah, definitely what you just said there was really important for like family members of like queer or LGBTQ community members. And next up, I want to talk a little bit more about your Filipino-American identity, because a lot of Filipino Americans tend to find themselves in this type of like intersectional identity. They think of themselves as sort of like a bit of a betweeners. And I know that you have an upcoming book which talks about being brown and gay in LA and the lives of immigrant sons. What really motivated you to write that book, and what do you hope to achieve with the book?
Oh my gosh. So remember how I was sharing earlier that like I was having trouble navigating my own sense of gay identity. The truth is, I think I pursued this project on gay sons of immigrants. It's about the experience of growing up gay in an immigrant family. I interview people who are Filipino as well as Mexican American, just get different perspectives on what that experience is like. And I think, to be honest, part of the reason I pursued that study is because I knew other gay men who were from immigrant families that had parents that were accepting, or that had family members that embraced who they were as gay men. And I just was wanting to understand, like, what's that experience like? How did you get there? Because I feel like that's not where I'm at with my own family. So I know a lot of times in social science research, we are often motivated by like some academic reason to pursue a topic. But for me, it was very personal why I decided to pursue the research for this book. And another reason I did is because I think that there's something super powerful when you're able to read about your experience. Like when you pick up a piece of paper and the words that are printed on there are words that like you can relate to. That's not a common experience for all people of color and queer people of color in the United States, because a lot of times the books that we read growing up are mostly about white people, straight people. And so I wanted to be able to produce something that, a random gay kid that's in an immigrant family would be able to relate to, or to be honest, even like a sibling of a gay child of immigrants, or the parent of a gay child of immigrants. I feel like that I wanted to write this so folks felt like they weren't alone, because a lot of times when you're gay growing up, it can feel very alone.
And I have a question about another interesting topic that I discovered as I continue producing Proudly Asian, which is how Filipinos in different places view the Filipino identity. Because I've interviewed some guests previously who were part Filipinos or like Filipino-Americans, but I think some of the listeners who are based in the Philippines actually messaged me, and it wasn't just one of them, it was like maybe multiple of them who messaged me telling me that, okay, they actually think Filipino Americans aren't really 100% Filipino. As a Filipino American man, I just want to know how you view this.
Yeah, I'm not always a fan of the litmus tests for who is authentically Filipino and who's not, right? Because I mean, even when you think about the history of the Philippines, it's like 7,000 islands of people that speak different languages, people that are of different skin tones and different religions. And so, you can pull that same card even with people that are living within the boundaries of the Philippine nation, right? You can ask yourself like, oh, what about Filipinos who are Muslim, or Filipinos who are darker skinned versus lighter skinned? And so I just don't think it's helpful to anybody to draw a line that says you're Filipino, like I'm Filipino and you're not. I don't really see the purpose of that. I think like the truth is Filipinos that live in the United States they're Filipino, but they have a very different experience, and that experience entails living in a society that is multiracial, living in a society that is where they're not the dominant group. It's like white people that are the dominant group, and living in a place where they're oftentimes in the minority in their schools, their neighborhoods, etc. And so I think that produces a very different sense of identity for Filipinos that grow up in the United States. And I just want to remind people in the Philippines that like the United States is pretty big. It's a pretty big country, right? I grew up in a neighborhood that had a lot of Filipinos, but there's other places that Filipinos grow up where there's maybe they're the only Filipino that lives there and their whole town. Maybe their family's the only one. And there's places like, Filipinos with different class statuses. So like my parents, I mentioned, were in professional jobs, a nurse and a real estate agent, but there's a lot of Filipinos that grow up with more working class backgrounds in places like Hawaii or the San Francisco Bay Area. And those things also matter as well for who you become as a person. And the reality is Filipinos are spread across the world in like 200 plus different countries. There's Filipinos in Hong Kong, Filipinos in Japan, Filipinos in the Middle East. And, who are we to say who is Filipino or not? Just because I wasn't born there and I didn't grow up there, I don't think it makes me any less Filipino. Or even if I don't speak the language, I don't think that makes me less Filipino. I just think it makes me a different kind of Filipino than the ones that live in the homeland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it very interesting because, like at the same time, Filipinos have other fights, like fighting to be recognized as Asian or Asian American, which is what you mentioned in your book. You were not, like there was this university study that you tried to sign up for, but then they told you were not Asian. And then at the same time, it's like fighting to be seen as American, which is sort of the issues that were mentioned in the Netflix documentary White Hot. People try to create a very set image about what America looks like.
Yeah.
And I also remember a while back that on your Twitter, you tweeted about how at some of the white colleagues, they would sort of see you or see you differently, or were the way that they interacted with you were quite dismissive. So definitely this is all contributing to the conversation of like, it's not quite there yet in terms of the debate over identities, either in America or like outside America.
Mm-hmm.
I want to follow up on the concept of motherland, because you did mention, how does one define one's identity, right? Like, is it by blood? Is it by skin color? Or is it by lived experience?
Wow, that's a really wonderful question. It's complicated. I think it's all of those things, right? And I think that's a hard question, right? Because if you say that it's lived experience, like what do you do with for example, like a white person that grows up in a predominantly black neighborhood? All of us, do they have the liberty to identify as black? Well, probably not, even though their lived experience is in a neighborhood where they're surrounded by mostly black residents. Is it by blood? Like I hesitate about that question too, because we have a long history of using bloodline as a way to discriminate or to exclude people from accessing their basic rights. So like, I think there's a lot of countries where bloodline is the determinant for whether you can gain citizenship. And what does that mean if you're not part of that bloodline, but you've had people living there for generations? It's kind of messed up. And I think, I live in the United States where, this is a country where bloodline, if you were even 1/32nd African descent, it means you're black. And what that meant is you can't have access to the same rights that white people can. And so it's really complicated. I think to a little cop out to your question, I think it's all of those things put together. It's like it's kind of like an equation where it's not just what you look like. It's not just who your parents are. It's not just, what country you're born in, but it's a combination of those things. And from those things, you make a determination of who belongs and who doesn't. I think that when it comes to identities like Asian, a lot of people forget that the term Asian, they think it's like a real identity with like some genetic foundation. But in reality, the term Asian is, as sociologists like to say, socially constructed. So in the United States, we didn't even have people identifying as Asian until the 1960s. It was a group of activists who were Filipino, Chinese, Japanese. They were like, you know what? We're getting really screwed in this country. We're experiencing a lot of racism, but our numbers are quite small. So we should band together and let's create a new identity called Asian American so that we can fight for our civil rights in the same way that like black people Mexican Americans, women are doing at the same time.
Yeah, I must say, I really agree with what you just said. During wartime, like how people even identify themselves could be kind of like based on a political reason or like based on a reason to protect themselves. So yeah, I just would like to use this time to remind people that, just because someone identifies as, Filipino-American, Filipino or Chinese, it doesn't actually tell the whole life story about that person. There isn't really kind of like a common experience that would be shared by everyone who shares the same ethnicity. But now it's time for us to move on to the next segment, which is called Rapid Bias. And in this segment, I'll be asking my guests biased questions they have got asked at some point in life. And in Anthony's case, biased questions gay people or Filipino Americans get asked a lot. So, Anthony, are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
First question. Are you the boy or the girl?
Oh, I hate that question. I think that I don't really get asked it a lot, but I think earlier in my gay life, people would like try to impose this framework of like there has to be a boy and a girl in the relation, even if both are boys. So yeah, I'm not a fan of that question. I think that like the beauty of being gay is that you don't have to adhere to the rules of masculinity or femininity, and so with me and my partner, we're both boys.
All gay men must be very girlish.
It's funny because people say that as it's a bad thing, but in a lot of ways, like if you watch like drag queens or men who express themselves in feminine ways, if you think about the first men who were able to fight for the civil rights of gay people, they were very effeminate men, right? Because they couldn't fit in society, and so they were the ones who fought the hardest. And so I think that growing up, we often think about being a man and being effeminate as opposite, but you can be whatever you want. I think that I've been really finding a lot of power in embracing non-traditional gender expressions.
Very well said. And next question. Homosexuality is a mental disorder.
Oh gosh. That one I have not come across, but among my older mentors who are gay that lived in a time when people framed it as a mental disorder. You know what? I think heterosexuality is a mental disorder because it forces people to like. It's a framework that limits the rights of women and limits the agency of women and has this assumption that men are smarter, stronger, or more deserving of things. And so I think that that's terrible. And so like, if I were to just in jest jokingly say like, actually no, I don't think homosexuality is a mental disorder at all. I think if anything, heterosexuality causes folks more mental trauma than homosexuality. And
next up, no one is born gay. You can just decide to stop being gay, right?
No, I don't think it works that way. It's what wonderful thing about having interviewed people about their gay experiences is a lot of these people already knew from age 4 or 5 years old that they didn't have the word gay, but they were just different. So I think some people come into their queer identity at different points in life. There's a lot of folks who are, they assume that they're heterosexual and they date someone that's of the, they're men, they date women, and they're women, they date men. And then later on in life, they meet someone and they realize, actually, wow, I could fall in love with someone of the same gender. So I think that like sexuality is, I don't think it's even as simple as like gay and straight. I just think that it's a spectrum where depending on your circumstance and your life, you can be different sexualities at different times of your life.
And Anthony, you are Filipino, so you're not Asian.
Oh yeah, so a lot of I think that a lot of Filipinos that grew up in LA, when they hear the word Asian, they're almost thinking about Korean folks or Chinese American folks. I think Filipinos are a little bit different because we have like the Spanish last names and then the Catholic thing going on. And so when I wrote that book in 2016, I think that, I interviewed people in 2009, 2010, where they would talk about, Filipinos don't really fit in with Asians. But what's interesting about this moment with all this anti-Asian violence, I think that it's actually like resurrecting Filipinos' sense of Asian identity, because a lot of the people that have been attacked are Filipino women. And so, I think like, what would I say? Filipinos are Asian American, but sometimes they'll feel a little ambivalent. And of course, it depends what part of the country you're in. Like my cousins that are in New Jersey are like, yeah, we're totally Asian. But the ones here in the West Coast, vary. They have varied relationships to that identity.
Interesting. And last question. You are not Filipino.
Oh gosh. Well, I think that statement says more about the person telling it to me than myself. Like, I'm Filipino. What's funny is one of the nice things about growing up in a really strong Filipino family and community is whenever that kind of statement gets said, it doesn't really bother me in the least bit. I don't feel any, it doesn't feel like an attack because I know who I am and that's the end of it.
Great. Thank you for playing this round of Rapid Fires, Anthony. To conclude the episodes, this episode is released during Pride Month. I would just like to get your thoughts into if you could raise awareness about one pressing issue in the LGBTQ plus community, what will it be?
Yeah, I think that if I had to pick just one issue, the LGBTQ community is a very diverse community, even though some people may not see it that way. And so I think sometimes people are obsessed with issues like gay marriage and same-sex marriage. And I think that's important. But what I would love for folks to know is that there's a lot of queer and trans women of color, especially Black women, who are experiencing a lot of violence and experiencing a lot of economic struggles, homelessness. And I think that although I think that gay marriage is important or gay representation in media is important, there's a lot of folks who are literally dying because of who they are. And I think it's important for us to pay more attention to the LGBTQ people that don't ever make it on television.
And Anthony, finally, our last question for you is, what does it mean to be proudly Filipino-American and queer?
Yeah, I think that being proudly Filipino-American is really owning the fact that you come from a history of people that were fighters and survivors and they were creative people that did a lot with what little they had. A lot of the early Filipinos that came here were discriminated against, racially discriminated against, were treated terribly. But despite that, we're able to form communities, to write their own histories, to tell their stories, to have families and have children. And I think that the ability to just live their lives despite all the terrible things that are being imposed on them, that's a really beautiful thing to celebrate. I think when it comes to being gay, I think that I wouldn't have said this as a kid, but I think being queer is the most magical thing in the world, because what that means is that you just look at the world in a very different way than what you're taught. And it means that you have more ability to see things outside of the box. You're more willing to break the rules because you're like, well, people are going to hate me anyway, so I might as well break the rules and see what happens. But I think that being queer, being proud of being queer is amazing, because you just get connected to it's an identity that connects you to people on a global scale. And you get to meet people that you would never have had the chance to meet if you weren't gay or queer. And I think that's wonderful. I think that, like the Filipino identity, queer people are a bunch of not just survivors, but fighters. They have fought for their place in society. They have fought to make their communities better. And I think that that's something to really be admired and celebrated.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Anthony, for taking the time to speak with us on Proudly Asian. That's it for this episode of Proudly Asian. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at proudly.asian for more content. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Leave us a 5-star review on wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and signing off for now. I'm Isabel Wong.